Alsof we in de studio zitten. Ja. Ja. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. Goedemiddag hier in de zaal en goedemiddag ook kijkers thuis. Welkom bij deze briefing van het Meerpartijen Initiatief voor seksuele en reproductieve gezondheid en rechten, inclusief HIV/AIDS. En voordat ik zo overga in het Engels, want ons panel bestaat vandaag uit mensen die Engels spreken en geen Nederlands. En ik hoop dat u daarmee akkoord bent. Wil ik iets meer vertellen over het MPI SRGR HIV/AIDS. Dat is een initiatief van de volgende partijen, en dat is toch altijd goed om te melden, die zich inzetten in het Nederlands parlement met ondersteuning van NGO's voor het bevorderen van seksuele gezondheid en rechten. In ons beleid, in onze wetgeving en eigenlijk alles wat we doen. De partijen die hebben ondertekend het Meerpartijen Initiatief, dat zijn D66, CDA, VVD, GroenLinks, Partij van de Arbeid, de Socialistische Partij, Bijeen, Fractie Den Haan, BBB en Volt. En wij kunnen dit alleen maar doen met de fantastische ondersteuning van het maatschappelijk middenveld. En het is dan ook heel belangrijk om de NGO's die dit mede mogelijk hebben gemaakt te noemen. En dat zijn AIDS-fonds, Amref, Rutgers, Wemos, Choice, COC Nederland, HIVOS, Oxfam en Plan. Ik ga over op het Engels. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, Lady Ross. Welcome, Tinashe Roever-Watso. I will introduce you both. My name is Alexander Hammelberg. I'm an MP for D66, Democrat 66, co-chair together with Evert from CDA, who's also here with us in the public, fighting for SRHR and everything that we do in Parliament, as I also mentioned in the introduction in Dutch, which you probably didn't understand anything of. So my apologies for that. Thank you for being here. And before we start with the introduction, also in English, I would like to briefly sketch what we are doing here today and what we are doing as a multi-party initiative for SRHR HIV/AIDS. We are an initiative of different parties in the Dutch Parliament who are fighting SRHR and are committed to doing so this year and the years to come. Specifically with this in mind, the Netherlands is one of the few countries in the world that has actually, without any taboos, have been a champion in SRHR, also working on SRHR in the human rights field, but also in development. And as one of the few countries in the world that is actually doing this without any reservation, it is extremely important to keep this going on, to keep the funding coming, and to make sure that we show consistency to all those vulnerable people in the world that actually need us to chip in and to take our responsibility. And it is also in this regard that today we're having conversations with two experts to talk about the current state of funding for SRHR in the world and the specific situation with the replenishment conference, having in mind the replenishment conference coming up by the end of the year in September of the Global Fund. And Lady Ross will explain a little bit more about what the Global Fund is and the importance of the Global Fund. So with further ado, I would like to have a short introduction before you both give your presentations, a short introduction about who you are. Lady Ross, to start with you, maybe you could introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you very much, Alexander, and thank you for convening this meeting. My name's Ros Marauta. I'm currently Vice Chair of the Board of the Global Fund. But how did I get involved in the Global Fund? I've lived in Papua New Guinea for the last 40 years, and in the early 1990s, many of members of our family, close friends, were dying from AIDS. And it was just through those personal relationships that I became involved in issues to do with AIDS and the struggle to try to conquer AIDS. And then, so I helped establish an NGO in Papua New Guinea. I was on the National AIDS Council. And then when my husband became Prime Minister, I saw this as a great opportunity to advance the work through anything I did as First Lady. And the issues of health for women and children, and specifically issues around HIV, became my focus of advocacy during that period. And then since then, of course, I've continued the work. And then with the Global Fund, I was asked to put my name forward to become chair of the CCM, the Country Coordinating Mechanism of Papua New Guinea, which is the local board that submits requests to the Global Fund, the funding requests, and then monitors the implementation of grants. So that's how I became involved with the Global Fund, through the Papua New Guinea CCM, and then later I became a board member for the Western Pacific region, and then I became vice chair.
Vice Chair, thank you, Lady Rose, and that's it's was fantastic to see that people are not committed to the cause for just a year or two, but that you keep on committed to the cause that is so incredibly important to many of us who have been facing discrimination also in health systems, but generally also. Tina,
thank you so much.
how are you?
I'm doing great.
You're doing great. It's a little bit strange that we're all sitting here so close together. Me as a COVID survivor, I would say, since last week, it feels a little bit odd, but we are fine, right? We are fine. How are you doing?
Well, I'm doing well. If I can also see people trying to then support the meaningful engagement of young people, that gives me so much joy.
This is something I would like to ask you, because you are a leader of a youth movement. Maybe you could tell a little bit more about the youth movement that you are heading, and maybe you can add also to this the extreme importance of involving youth in all policies, also when it comes to SRHR, and not only youth, but specific community youth.
Great.
Because it's often people talking about communities without actually knowing what their needs are.
Yeah. So we have what we call the Global Network of Young People Living with HIV, which is more of a youth network for and by young people who are living with HIV in all our diversity. So we talk about adolescent girls and young women. We talk about young people who identify as LGBTIQ, who are also part of that. We have national networks of young people living with HIV at country level, and also the regional networks at regional level who are also affiliated to our work. We are working on 3 key aspects. The first one, which is also looking at capacity strengthening of the national networks of young people living with HIV. We are also looking at issues around involving young people in key decision-making spaces that impacts our health and rights. Advocacy, when we talk about young people, we want young people to be at the forefront, not for other people to then panic when they are asked on issues that are being faced by young people.
What happens if policymakers with their best interests in mind do not involve youth in their policy work and everything they do? What happens? What goes wrong, basically?
So I think one of the dangers that comes with that is to misfire on things, because as young people, our lived experiences, they have a lot to tell when we look at policy. I was at the World Health Assembly, and there was a debate on the issues of terms on one of the strategies, like we should not include transgender, we should not include the LGBTIQ, but as a young person, if I am there with my lived experience of a young gay man who is living with HIV, who also had issues to access sexual reproductive health services, that would really help people to look at the policy and look at policies that works for young people. So meaningful engagement is very important. We are not only talking about having a young person seated in this room, but we want to give a voice to that young person that would inform and impact.
So for many people that are watching at home, I call the policy making black box. So it is a policymaker sitting in a room somewhere at a ministry or a big conference or some place within the United Nations system, for instance, or the World Health Organization for that matter. They're sitting together discussing policies, and often, and I hope I'm not going to insult anyone, but it's often people that are from elites.
Yep.
People that have not faced a lived reality, not being a woman, often not being a woman, mostly men, not being part of the LGBTI community, for instance, not even having ever met a trans woman, for instance, and then suddenly the decision has been made, thank God, to involve civil society organizations, not only into the room as spectators, but they can often speak. In many of those areas, they can now speak, which is a major accomplishment. You went to those meetings, or a few of those meetings, and
Yep.
you're speaking to those policymakers with their best ideas in mind. Do they actually listen? Is it something that suddenly, when there's someone in front of them that actually talks about that lived reality, does it have an impact?
Yeah. So in my 8 years of working in the youth engagement space, I've also seen that we have got two groups of people. We have people who are very passionate about having the voices of young people at the table. We also have a group of people who want to have young people so that they can tick on their box to say there were 3 young people at this meeting. But one of the key messages that I would also like to share is that it is very important to look at young people not only as beneficiaries, but also as partners. My lived reality can inform a decision that is going to impact many young people. As I'm sitting here, I'm the only young person, but I feel like I have the burden of all the young people
I'm
in the
23,
world.
by the way. You never asked me.
Not age-wise, but the work that you are doing. I feel like if all the young people who have walked through the same journey that I did, if things they do not change, then what is it going to be looking like? We have got young people who are vocal. We also have young people who are afraid to stand up for themselves. So we need to be engaged as equal partners and not only as beneficiaries.
Right, right.
Yep.
No, it's fantastic what you're doing. And I can imagine that being there and speaking out in all those policy-making arenas where you are taking place, and not only you, a lot of other advocates around the world, in Zim, in Southern Africa, but around the world globally, that are fighting the fight and stepping up and making themselves heard. Often with also support of fantastic local NGOs or Dutch NGOs that are doing tremendous work. I can only imagine that it's not everyone in those, not all those policymakers will definitely listen, or there will be no discrimination within those arenas at all. But I can also imagine that for people actually listening to someone who is from those communities, that actually shares those experiences and makes people know what the impact is on their own lives,
True.
of discrimination, exclusion from healthcare systems, hate crimes. That it actually does make an impact on the percentage of those policymakers, which actually makes the paradigm change and shift a little bit. Is that correct? Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah, it is. And also, I think it also reminded me of my internship days as a young person. I went to the Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education in Zimbabwe. We were looking at having a life skills strategy being launched. So I met with the acting PEMSEC, and I was very, very tiny, not now. So she said something that really pained me a lot. She said, I do not discuss policy with young people. I don't discuss policies with an intern, but forgetting that I am the newest blood from school, and the challenges that I've experienced, I would even bring it up to them. So it's one thing that also gave me the passion to then keep on pushing, to say we need this, I need to be involved in these decision-making spaces, to change the narrative of how young people, they are portrayed in a number of platforms.
Yeah, definitely. Fantastic work. Thank you for this introduction to your work. We will get back to you on the importance of funding and what has to be done in the months to come. Lady Ross, in everything that you've been doing, also within the Global Fund, but everything that you've been doing, participation of people from actual representatives from the communities, how did you try to incorporate them in everything that you've been doing?
Well, I'll just talk about the Global Fund because it's quite a unique institution in the global health landscape. It's really the only institution where people living with disease and civil society have an equal voice as a donor. And that's really refreshing. It's really refreshing. So where the governance model is one of is based on partnership. It's a partnership of governments, of civil society, of the private sector, of technical partners, and of people living with the 3 diseases,
Yeah.
all with an equal voice and decision-making power.
Is that such a, I think for the people back home, and also people watching through the live stream, again, I'm calling this the policymakers' black box. No one really knows, understands how these, it's such a complicated system. Why is this so special? What happens normally?
Well, normally it's either the donors making the decision, and just as Tinashe was saying, you're just a recipient.
Yeah.
You're seen as a beneficiary. That's not the case with the Global Fund. Those receiving the money or those affected by disease have exactly the same amount of power, both at country level through the CCMs and at the global level through the board.
Yeah.
And it makes for a completely different discussion about issues. Completely different discussion.
Do you have an example?
Oh, well,
Difficult question.
I don't think at the World Health Assembly you'd have people necessarily living with HIV or young people talking about their own personal experience and how programs need to change in order to meet their needs.
Yeah. Yeah, I would like to dig into those needs, because I can only imagine to just look at examples, and maybe you can help us out here as well. The moment that you have symptoms or you fear that you have HIV, for instance, that you go to a health clinic, what would be the general experience in Zimbabwe, for instance?
Okay, so I think I'll also try to speak beyond Zimbabwe
Sure,
because of
yeah.
the work that we do. Yeah. So I think for myself, I would like maybe to start by also making people understand how did I get to know about my HIV status, because I was not born with HIV. At school, I thought if someone has to get HIV, they are going to be having sex with someone who is of the opposite sex with them. That was my own assumption. And I was busy partying, like how other young people, they might also pass through, like to have all the fun and stuff. And later on, it also happened through someone who then said they were on PrEP, which was not the case. So I wanted to go and get PrEP at the health facility.
Maybe you should explain briefly what PrEP is for
it's the pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is more of an HIV prevention method for people to then prevent themselves from getting HIV. And normally in some countries, there is a priority group that is looked at, like the LGBTIQ community, young people or people who sell sex. They can also have access to that. So they said before that, we need to then run a test. So they had to do the test. I was busy working somewhere. They then called me. They broke the news to me. And I was like, wow. It was like a shock to me, because in Zimbabwe, I'm someone who is very engaged in sexual reproductive health and HIV information dissemination. If people, they need any information, they would call me to ask, how do you go about this and stuff? So it was very difficult for me. The only question that I was also afraid to be asked was how. How did you get HIV? Being a young gay person, I tried to narrate my story with a she in the story.
Right.
Later on, I then forgot and mentioned a he, which was also kind of a difficult piece to then look at. The advantage that I had was that as someone who is well known in the country, I got some of the services from a good clinic which treats people who are living with HIV, and I never had any challenge. But with most young people, there are no viral load machines, which can also test if they are initially diagnosed with HIV, how is their viral load, the amount of HIV in the blood, how is their immune system destroyed by the virus. And those are some of the things that we talk about only access, because young people, they will then be initiated on treatment, which is very important, but also to really look at how this medication is happening. Many times, young people, they face stigma. When they go to the health facility, if they're a young person who is selling sex, the healthcare providers, they can call all sorts of names, which are not inhuman. At the end, this young person might not then need to go to the health facility to access any medication or maybe any treatment. in most cases as well, if young people, they go to these health facilities, the a kind of conversation that is happening, because if I go and see someone who is a bit older from my age, I might not be as open as I want to be on how things they are happening, to look beyond biomedics, to also look at mental health issues. I can try to hide all the things within me because I will not be that open to them. Luckily, with the issue of other resources from the Global Fund, there are also other health facilities that are now looking at the yes, and also the quality of life of people who are living with HIV, to say we need to look beyond medication, but to look at the well-being of the person, to run tests so that a person can be initiated on the right regimen.
Treatment without, and healthcare without any stigma, without any discrimination, which is often still in many areas of the world still the case. If not worse, for healthcare providers to, even in some countries, to still call the police the moment they find out that you are a man who has sex with men, for instance, or you are a transgender sex worker, facing all the issues, not to mention the horrible amount of murders, for instance, based on these facts. So it's basically, for most people, unfortunately, until today, not a safe space to go to a doctor when you have the idea or a general thought that you have an STD, for instance, or HIV, or Thank you for sharing that experience. Lady Ross, going back to the Global Fund.
Yes. I just wanted to add on to something Tinashe said about the way health systems work. Most people, when they go to a clinic, particularly in developing countries, will face huge stigma and discrimination if they're, even with TB as well as HIV. And it's so important to involve peers, people living with HIV or TB, in the health clinics. It provides an enormous amount of support to people coming forward, allowing them to disclose, tell the story properly so that they can be properly diagnosed. And that's one of the ways that the Global Fund tries to make sure that there are people sympathetic to gay men, to sex workers, to LGBTQI people.
Unmarried
trans
women.
Yes. I mean, for trans people, particularly in my country, it's extremely difficult for them to disclose. Huge discrimination and stigma. So important to have friendly faces at clinics and people that will sit by you and help you through whatever you need to face to get treatment.
Definitely, and then we have identified in the last 20 minutes, we have identified the problems and the stigmas and the discrimination that leads to the most difficult situations. Then we were doing relatively okay before pre-COVID with funding for SRGR, for instance.
Yes.
For the fight against tuberculosis, for instance, and then COVID came. What happened?
COVID has put us back for the first time. The Global Fund was established 20 years ago, and we made enormous strides in the first years until COVID.
It's a bit of a shame that we don't have the statistics here, but imagine lines going like
Exactly.
Like this.
Well, the partnership saved 44 million lives in that period. Deaths from the 3 diseases came down by 40%. So we're talking about hundreds of millions of people with access to treatment for HIV, TB, and malaria. But we've gone backwards significantly as a result of COVID in all 3 diseases.
And I've heard that we could go back, if we don't do anything about that, we could go back to levels unprecedented even.
Absolutely. And it's so important now for us to understand that we must not lose those gains, which is why the new investment case for the Global Fund is to the basis for next replenishment, which will
because
take place in September.
The fund, maybe you can explain also to the people what is going to happen in September.
What's going to happen in September is that President Biden and the US government will host the 7th replenishment of the Global Fund. We work on 3-year funding cycles. So this will be for 2023, 2026. And our target is a very ambitious one. We hope to raise $18 billion at least. And it is at least. And that figure has been arrived at through an analysis of where we are with the diseases at the moment, the effect of COVID on them, and what it will take for us to get back on track to achieve the 2030 goals of elimination of the 3 diseases.
Yeah.
So 18 billion is the minimum we need, and that's a 30% increase over what we raised in 2014 in Lyon. It's ambitious. We know that things are difficult throughout the world. The Ukraine conflict is putting extra pressure on governments in the West particularly, but also having an effect on energy prices, inflation, food security, all throughout the world. It's a very difficult environment.
This is on top of, because now you're mentioning the impact of the Russian invasion into Ukraine and the global impact, the regional and the global impact also. I can imagine, we know that funding is actually now all going to that region, and there's a good reason also.
Yes.
But that also has implications, double implications for instance, fighting diseases in the world.
It does, but we must not forget them. We must not forget everything else in the world and just focus on one issue.
Because it's a double impact.
It's a double impact, and the cost of inaction will be so great, not just in terms of money to recover later, but in all the millions of people who will die in the meantime.
Yeah, because Tinashe, COVID-19 came, and that meant that a lot of the funding globally that was actually going to also SRHR, but also to civil society to fight those stigmas, for instance, was actually refunneled towards fighting the pandemic, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That meant an immediate decrease in available funding for civil society organizations, for healthcare providers that work inclusively, for instance. Did you also, and your membership also have witnessed, did they all witness the same issue?
Yeah, so I think also looking at beyond the funding piece, there was also a lot of issues that happened at health service delivery for young people living with HIV because of the restrictions. I would give an example in countries such as Uganda, Kenya, and Zimbabwe. Young people, they were denied any access to then travel, including myself. I missed lots of appointments at the health facility, missing doses, because I could not provide a letter that would give the reason why I need to then travel to the health facility. And also looking at the impact, like what was also said before by Lady Rose, that there's also a decline on the achievements that we were also looking at, because when we are denied access to services, then it means if I'm going a week or two without medication, then that's a hassle on its own. But in some countries, there were also peer-to-peer supporters who then resorted to make use of bicycles so that they can run away from the roadblocks and then deliver medication to their peers. And in terms of the funding landscape, most of the shift was to COVID-19 to then respond to the emergency. Many young people, they were breadwinners and not having any formal job where they can be paid at the end of the month, and that was all distracted. And we tried as much as we can to ensure that we also provide things such as food and for them to have more of a better mental health outcome. But as we also look into the future, because of the issues of funding and also resources, we need to then look at all other diseases, as mentioned by Lady Rose, not only focusing on COVID, because there are gains that we have made before, and how do we ensure that we don't lose that? So the only way we can do that is to step up and ensure that we also have additional resources for the 3 diseases. And if we look at it, we are also guaranteed that we are looking at people who are having a happy, healthy, safe, and fulfilling lives.
So to just make sense of everything that we are, because I think we're stacking issues here, and I think that's also important to have a clear understanding about what was going on. So what you're both concluding is actually that things were relatively on track pre-COVID, and then COVID came. That meant that the funding dried up for fighting the diseases, for SRHR and HIV/AIDS. That access to healthcare, general healthcare, but also getting to the healthcare was restricted by the impact of COVID-19, which needed extra funding actually to overcome that, which never came. With all the health implications for individuals, mental health issues also, but also physical health issues. And then on top of this, the war came in Eastern Europe, which basically also meant, again, refunding funding, existing funding to the conflict and the impact of the conflict, mostly food security. So we are at a deplorable state of funding at this point then.
We're at a critical state.
Critical.
We're at a critical state. And you can't see that donors' ODA budgets can really be used to cover these additional issues, which are just as important as the traditional ones. We have to find other money and use money more smartly than we have in the past. And I would make the case that the Global Fund is a very smart investment. Our overhead costs are very low. We measure the impact of what we do. It's a lot of bilateral aid does not do that. It's an empty pot. You don't know where it's going and what it does. But the Global Fund is quite different. And I think that's important for people to understand, that you can see the results of the funding, and it does work. Yeah. It does work.
Yeah. So what needs to be done in the coming months? What is your call to us all? Also parliamentarians who are here or will be looking back at the video whenever they get the chance.
Well, my call is that the Netherlands government would step up just as the US government has done.
And what has the US government
The US
done?
government has already announced what it has appropriated for 2023, $2 billion with an indication that that's the first of a $6 billion pledge over the 3 years. And the US government is only allowed to give us 1/3 of our funding. So our job is now to find $12 billion to match the $6 billion, which is the 1/3. That's where we get the 18 billion minimum from. Yep. So of course it will require all other donors to step up to the same way by 30%. And if we don't get the $12 billion from other donors, we will lose some of the American money because they're only by law allowed to fund 1/3 of the total funding of the Global Fund. Yep. They have a law that actually sets that out. So if we don't get the 12 billion, we'll be leaving some of the 6 billion on the table, which is criminal. If you're someone suffering in a low and middle income country from HIV, TB, malaria, or any other pandemic that might come. A lot of our work goes to strengthening health systems. Over 1/3 of our money is invested in strengthening health systems, which obviously will help countries fight future pandemics, apart from disease generally.
Which is a win-win situation.
It's a win-win situation. It's a win-win situation.
One of the big scares is that around the globe, ministers of development are refocusing on strengthening health systems and instead of specifically fighting certain diseases. There's a case to make for this, but it also works
you can
the other way
integrate
around.
it too. You can integrate it too through disease programs. You can tackle supply chain issues, procurement issues, laboratory system strengthening, training of health workers. In doing all of that, you're helping strengthen the health system to fight any disease, not just HIV, TB, malaria, or COVID. Yep. But coming back to the Netherlands, I would hope that you and your colleague here and all other parliamentarians would really help advocate to the government the need for the Netherlands to increase its pledge at this 7th replenishment conference. Currently, at the last replenishment, you pledged just over 150 million euros. But in the intervening period, you've generously given to our COVID response. So in fact, the total amount of money that the Netherlands government has given for this current period has amounted to 183 million euros. So we see that as the base. And we are looking for a 202 million euro pledge over the 3-year period from the Netherlands.
Well, there you go.
So anything you can do to help us achieve that. I'm looking at
my colleague. People don't see this at home.
Anything that you all can do to achieve that would be not just appreciated by the Global Fund, but by all the people who will benefit from the funding.
And then to be fair, Lady Ross, we're not only talking about the Global Fund.
No, of
when we're
course.
fighting SRHR, because we also have the Global Equality Fund and all the important work that has been done to support civil society and advocacy capacity building, for instance, to make their case for stronger and inclusive health systems back home. So it's not those, the figures even go up, if I understand you well. Yeah.
They do, but the Global Fund also does a lot in sexual and reproductive
Absolutely.
health.
And
And
because we don't only want to talk, we don't want to walk out here in half an hour or 45 minutes with a miserable feeling, of course.
No.
What happens if we, as a Dutch parliament and our minister says, okay, let's do this? What will be the outcome? What is the importance of it?
well, the importance is saving lives.
Saving lives.
Saving lives, that's what we're talking about. Saving lives, giving people a dignified life, and helping to overcome issues of discrimination and stigma.
What can be done with the 18 billion? If, let's say, your mission accomplished, and I hope truly...
With the 18 billion, we estimate we will save another 20 million lives over those 3 years.
Yeah.
That's something we should all be wanting to do.
Yeah. And it says something also about the fight against the numbers and the statistics when it comes to fighting these diseases, and the impacts. Can the impact of COVID-19 be undone also?
It can. With more investment and smarter investment.
Smarter investment.
And we have to realize now that we were not prepared well for COVID-19, and we need to prepare better for the next pandemic, which will inevitably occur.
Yeah.
But by strengthening health systems, you can do that.
Thank you. I would like to open up the room also for questions, the conversation for questions from the room. And we have Lyle here. Maybe you can do a starter, Lyle, since you have the microphone. Do you have a question yourself?
Yeah, I'm actually also wondering what is the link between economic development and investments in the Global Fund?
Well, investments in health are a very important link. The economic returns from health investments are huge, like 13 to 1. I mean, they're huge. So if we're looking at it just from a purely economic angle, it makes sense to invest in health. The IMF have quantified the effect of COVID and the loss to the economy, the global economy, as a result of it. But they've also quantified what an investment in health will do. And I mean, we're talking about quadrupling the economy by a significant investment in health.
Maybe another question that I have,
Yeah.
What happens if a war breaks out like in Ukraine? How does the Global Fund step in to make sure that...
Yes, thanks. Well, we have an emergency fund. Our ongoing programs we try to maintain in countries that are suffering conflict, but we've also been able to allocate a significant additional amount of money from the emergency fund to Ukraine and to Ethiopia and to Afghanistan and to Myanmar through this emergency fund to help maintain services, get life-saving treatment to people in conflict zones.
Yeah. Because we are often talking about conflict zone Ukraine, and we slowly start to understand what the impact is also of this conflict for food securities in Europe and North Africa, the Horn of Africa, but also Central Asia. We are less talking about that region actually, reaching all the way Pakistan, India even. And this is again on top of a horrible situation already taking place in Ethiopia, for instance, but you also mentioned Myanmar. So the need is increasing and increasing.
The need is increasing.
Yeah, yeah.
But we mustn't be gloomy. We just have to get on and do the job.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's why we're here. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. Thank you, Lyle. Lyle has the microphone. If there is anyone else with a specific question, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your experiences, and your call, which is heard. My name is Fabienne Simonel, and I represent political party Bijeen. Unfortunately, our MP and party leader, Sylvana Simons, couldn't attend, but I'm representing her more or less. I was wondering if you could share your perspective on whether you want to continue business as usual with your priorities as Global Fund, but also more as the global HIV movement, or whether the COVID pandemic has shifted priorities, whether there's something that needs to be changed in order to counteract the setbacks that have occurred as an effect of the COVID pandemic. That's my first question. Maybe answer. Can I pose the second question as well?
We do. You can keep the microphone because we have some time and it's okay. And then do it question by question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say we've shifted priorities, we've added on priorities. We still have a very clear focus on the elimination of HIV, TB, and malaria, and strengthening health systems. But pandemic preparedness is also a goal of the Global Fund under the new strategy. We have spent $4.3 billion. We've allocated $4.3 billion in the last 2 years to fighting COVID, helping low and middle income countries respond to COVID. Not covering vaccines at all, the non-vaccine side of the COVID response. And I'm sure that this will need to continue. COVID has shown us clearly the need to be better prepared for pandemics. The Global Fund basically is an organization that fights pandemics. That's what HIV, TB, and malaria are. They've just been around for much longer than COVID, but there will be new ones. So you could argue that we're ideally placed to fight future pandemics as well. And it is now part of our remit through the health system strengthening work that we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And your second question?
Well, maybe Tinesh also.
Yeah. So I think what we have also tried to add from our end is to ensure that we involve communities in the pandemic preparedness response mechanism, to have communities at the center. And from the young people side, we have looked at how best organizations, donors can also engage young people in more of an ethical and meaningful way, because in COVID, it was more of virtual meetings. And we are looking at a young person who might want to contribute to a process, but without any support for data. And in the COVID time, that is when there was also the new strategy for the Global Fund that was also developed. And there was that kind of an ethical engagement for young people from the regions and also at a global level to air in their challenges and how best they can also inform to the solutions. So when we talk about ethical engagement, we are looking at young people being engaged in a way that would make them feel more involved. Not only maybe to have a young person to share their own experiences, but what is then going to be coming beyond that. So it was also one of the lessons that we then learned to say it goes beyond sharing experiences, but informing some of the processes, like the new strategy for the Global Fund, which is also very important. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think maybe partly my second question has been answered already. I was curious to hear your thoughts on how we could bring the lessons learned from combating the HIV pandemic, because you have so much experience in this already, how we could use those lessons in combating COVID and future pandemics as the Netherlands, because we are involved in international efforts to combat COVID worldwide. What are your thoughts on how to bring those lessons to the future?
The key is working with communities. And I think the Netherlands is very well placed to show the lead in this. The HIV response told us clearly that unless you work with and through communities, you won't succeed. And COVID has taught us that too. But from the donor perspective, I think Netherlands is very well placed to help argue that case through what you do, how you fund programs, and make the case to other donors on the importance of community systems.
So maybe I can ask you both one question that people might wonder how that works. So you have a country, you work in a certain country where the healthcare systems are, not so doing so well with LGBTI communities, for instance, or there's an issue around safe abortion, to mention one of those issues that is also extremely under discussion at this point in Europe and also in the Netherlands. And then the Global Fund comes, for instance, and says, okay, but we are going to work around this issue. What are the challenges that you face and which opportunities do you have, and how can you use support of a country like the Netherlands in this to get work done?
Through general advocacy, obviously both at the global level but at country level through your own bilateral relations with countries, because a lot of the countries we work in, there are quite discriminatory laws. And I can't say that we tackle this in an indirect way. Obviously we need to work in the country and with the communities and with the vulnerable people who are affected by the diseases. So you can't imperil that in any way. So you might quietly advocate for these things, but not necessarily publicly to shame governments and so on. But the Netherlands has such a rich history of its own in combating these issues. So just the demonstration effect alone and being able to explain to countries why it has worked in the Netherlands is really important.
Yeah. Because just to delve into history, not so long ago, just a few decades ago, it was basically illegal to organize anything around specific issues like abortion or men who have sex with men without being harassed by the police until 50s. So we have had our own experience there as well. Exactly. Good point. Evert, please, introduce yourself maybe also to everyone. That would be nice.
First, I'd like to thank Lady Ross and Tinashe because of their very stories. Well, make me give some chicken skin, I would say. It's very important, your work. I'm Evert-Jan Slootweg. I'm a member of the Christian Democratic Party. I feel very obliged by your question and what we can do in the Netherlands. I think also that it gives us a way to make our Prime Minister, someone with very much international experience, Mark Rutte, to do something, because I think what the Netherlands can do is necessary, but I think we can do a bit more together in the European Union. And I like to know what you do from the Global Fund to explain how do you cooperate. You say we do that with communities, but what is the cooperation with the Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières? How do you cooperate? Because I think cooperation is very important to make some effort to change this, the fight against these diseases.
Well, maybe just to because if you mention Red Cross, for instance, we're talking about emergency situations, not so much general healthcare systems. So your question is also specifically about those emergency situations and warlike situations. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, obviously, many donors cooperate in those situations. Our emergency funding for Ukraine, for example, we're working very closely with the Red Cross. And we do work with Médecins Sans Frontières in some countries, but it depends on the country too and the context. So it's not something you can generalize. But Global Fund is a partnership. I think one of the things COVID has taught us is that the need for global health institutions to work much more closely together, and through the ACT Accelerator At least some of us have been able to do that to great beneficial effect, I would argue. And it has to continue for the future. The architecture has been too fragmented in the past, but COVID has helped bring some of the institutions together. We have to build on what we've got, not keep reinventing the wheel.
Important warning. Anything to add to that?
I can add from how we have been supported by the Have Voice Fund by the Global Fund through the Have Voice Fund, which is an intervention that is looking at adolescent girls and young women in all their diversity, including those who identify as lesbians, bisexual, transgender, and queer. It seeks to really empower young people and ensuring that as AGYWs, they also have a voice in key decision-making spaces. And it's something that has been also very much helpful because it also informs some of the policies, like how you have also mentioned at country level, to say if there is a policy that is being developed at country level, what do adolescent girls and young women need? So I see it as more of an important piece to be also invested so much in, because as we all look, things, they seem to be changing over and over. And we also need to ensure that adolescent girls and young women, they have a voice on what they need. When we talk about the health and rights of AGYW, what exactly do they need? So we need to create spaces, but also financial commitment is very important so that they are able to implement some of the interventions. So this initiative is in 13 countries in Africa.
Southern Africa. And a lot to learn from it. Girls in that region are twice as likely to contract HIV as boys of the same age. So hugely important if we're talking about prevention and elimination of the disease.
Yeah. And unfortunately to say, this is what I know from my experience, and I'm sitting here anyway. So, in actual warlike situations, emergency situations, unfortunately, is the case that organizations such as the Red Cross are just trying to get everyone food security, treatment, medicine, without any discrimination. And unfortunately, also in those situations, it's extremely difficult for them to have a specific eye to communities that have specific needs that wouldn't necessarily go to an organization like the Red Cross for help, because they face the fear of discrimination. So they have special policies developed now for the safety of women, but not for LGBTIQ, for instance, or ethnic minorities for that matter in certain areas. So it is in a continuous conversation that is being held across the board. And unfortunately, the discrimination also persists in those emergency situations. More like, I would say, that actually it double impacts certain communities. Any other questions?
Over here.
Oh, yes.
Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Devi Kepi. I work with Women Equals Men. I'm particularly interested in what you mentioned about youth participation and meaningful participation. And I was wondering how the Global Fund has that structurally in its governance, whether there's a governance system that enables meaningful youth participation and
Starting with youth?
Okay, thank you so much for that. So the Global Fund, they have what they call the Youth Council, which is more of a council of young people in all our diversity, young people living with HIV, young people who identify as lesbians, bisexuals, transgender, young people who sell sex, young people who use drugs from all over the world. So they sit with the Global Fund Executive Director to bring issues that are happening at ground level for our young people and also offer some of the solutions on how this can be dealt with. So we have also seen it as more of a helpful piece, because all the young people, we can't air our challenges to the same person, but it is very important to have those young people who can also represent us in those spaces. Talking about participation, I'm also happy to let you know that when the strategy for the Global Fund was being developed, we also got a grant, like financial resources, to coordinate ourselves as young people so that we can inform its direction, and it was not only to inform its development, but also when it was finalized, we also had to meet with the community and rights gender team so that we can also validate it. There was a presentation that was also shared to say these are the things that came out and this is more of a final document, and we also had a say on that. When we look at country level through the Her Voice Fund, we have also have adolescent girls and young women who also sit in the country coordination mechanism board, where they also inform some of the processes that are happening at country level. So in summation, to us, we saw it as an ethical, the reason being that the Global Fund has moved from having young people as more of more of a chair where someone would just come and sit, but to ensure that there's also a voice for young people. But beyond that, there's also leadership of young people. As the Global Network of Young People Living with HIV, we are also leading the Her Voice Fund, where we are managing that grant, and we are looking at having over 100 grantees at country level, which is also very important when you talk about participation, leadership, and also engagement. I think that's my submission on that. Maybe
that's exactly what I'd hoped you'd explain, Tinashe. And so both at the Secretariat level, but also at the board, we really value the Youth Council, and I'm looking at in the future how we can involve them more. It's been a little bit difficult through the pandemic and everything being virtual, but now that we're getting back to normal life, I'm hoping that we will have greater involvement of the Youth Council with the board. They have attended board meetings, but as observers. But I'm sure there are many ways that we can continue to involve them more in the future. And to also encourage CCMs to have young people on the CCMs.
Maybe CCM. Maybe
yes,
you can explain to us.
Sorry, in each country where the Global Fund has grants, we have a country coordinating mechanism, which is like the local board of the Global Fund, made up of people from government, from donors, from technical agencies, from the private sector, from civil society, churches, people living with disease. So also a partnership at the country level. But we've been encouraging, in Papua New Guinea we have a youth member of the CCM as one of the civil society representatives. We have a majority of civil society on our CCM.
Which is a beautiful thing we just learned. Annika, I thought you had a question as well.
Yes, thank you. My name is Annika Snel. I'm also from Women Equals Men. My question concerns the concept of breaking the silos. Several years ago, I've been slightly involved with work surrounding the Global Fund here in the Netherlands. And back then, it was a big topic of discussion because there's a lot of work to be done on that concept still in different kind of fields, mind you. But I was wondering how the Global Fund goes about it with combating these 3 diseases.
And then for the people back home, I mean, let's talk about clarity and jargon and all that. The silos. What do you mean by the silos?
Yeah. So unfortunately, in a lot of fields, you see that work on, for instance, combating different diseases like HIV, AIDS, and tuberculosis and malaria is structured among so-called silos. So from where the funding starts and programs are being financed until the work that's being done on the ground, there is one stream that kind of goes top down, whereas there are actually intersections that when you could work on those intersections in practice, you'd be a lot more effective.
I actually beg to differ.
Please.
Yeah, it actually starts at country level, and you will find that nearly every Ministry for Health has disease programs organized as disease programs. So it's very hard. It's not a question of the funding per se. That's how the world operates. So the question is, how can we get more integration? And yes, the way the funds flow has a role to play in that. But more importantly is how ministries of health organize themselves and see the need and the efficiencies of working across disease, not just by disease.
You can beg to differ. I mean, it's, because it is an interesting discussion.
Well, yeah, but you know, to get the HIV manager to talk to the TB manager in the health ministry, often they're in completely different buildings. They have their own budgets. They have their own work programs. It's not easy, but that's where it has to happen. That's where it counts.
Oh, interesting. Does that satisfy your need for an answer, or is it something because
It's just a slant.
because there is something to say about how you design the funding schemes, also allowing for cooperation on ministerial level or even lower levels, which is not often the case. So I think it goes hand in hand also a little bit. Any more questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Beatrice Stickers from KNCV Tuberculosis Foundation. My question is, well, I know that when, the Global Fund is asking for 18 billion for this 3-year period that is coming, we do know that that's just a small part of the overall amount that is needed. And could you say something on how the Global Fund is pushing the agenda that countries will be committing more money to the fight of the diseases and making sure that a good part of it continues to go to the SRHR priorities?
Thanks very much, Beatrice. The 18 billion minimum is predicated on the Global Fund contributing 14% of the total needs globally, which is traditionally what we have been contributing. But 44% of the money required will come from countries themselves. We've had quite a lot of success through co-financing policies, which require countries to demonstrate that they're spending X amount of money also on the diseases for Global Fund grants to continue. It has been successful in the last few years. There has been a big increase, and countries can demonstrate what they're spending on these diseases. And that will continue. There's no way that the co-financing policy will not continue. But 14% is a very small amount. So the $18 billion that we're asking for minimum is a very small amount of what's required. And let's hope that the rest also materializes, along with our $18 billion.
It's affection. Yeah. Looking at the time, we still have some, but I would also like to give Tinashe and Lady Ross some final space for final remarks and final calls to Dutch Parliament, because that's what we're here for in the end.
Maybe Tinashe can go first.
Maybe Tinashe would go first.
Okay, thank you so much for the honor.
Well, you can also go second if you like.
No, that's fine. So I would encourage the Dutch government to step up the fight and also invest in the Global Fund, so that at least as youth-led organizations, we can also get additional resources, not only at global level, but also at country level, which is also very important. I think most of us, they can also agree with me, especially in the Global South countries, to say there has been limited funding for the organizations that we also work with, like the national networks of young people living with HIV, the movements of lesbians, bisexuals, transgender. And it is very important to continue investing in that so that we can be involved in key decision-making spaces that impacts our health and rights. The other thing that I also strongly feel that we need to then also look at is the bigger political and financial commitment and leadership. As young people, if we go to the health facilities, we do not want to then struggle to access services. We don't want to go through all the hoops of fire so that we can get something, but it's just supposed to be more of a conducive environment for us to to go to, and they access services that are non-judgmental, but that can also be done if there is more of a political commitment on that. Addressing the issues of gender inequality, I think we have also done a lot through the Global Fund when we talk about some of the repressive laws that were in the countries. You have also asked before on the LGBTIQ laws in some countries and how that is being done, which has also helped a lot. But I think we also need to do more to ensure that we have addressed issues around gender inequality if we want to then end AIDS. Those are some of the things that we also strongly need to ensure that they are addressed and people to go to the health facilities to get access to their medication. One of the things that I would also want to highlight is how can the Dutch government can also help other countries to then observe human rights. In COVID-19, there have been a lot of human rights violations that were also happening in the countries, and that has a huge impact on issues around HIV and sexual reproductive health services. How can those countries also learn from the Dutch government on how best any person would feel safe in a country? Equal rights for all the people in countries does not mean less rights for someone, because these are rights for all of us. We are all humans, and there's no human who is more superior than the other. So those are some of the things that I strongly feel we need to look at. I would also encourage the Dutch government to invest more in youth leadership and youth engagement, even as you work towards working on a global health strategy. It is also very important to ensure that the voices of young people in all our diversity is also included, and the engagement should also be not just an engagement for the young people, but to also take lessons from the lived realities of young people to be incorporated in the strategy. As young people, we know what works for us. We have done many things in terms of planning with young people, implementation with young people, monitoring and evaluation of some programs with young people, and we have seen so many results being yielded from that. So in summation, I would say those are the things that I strongly feel we also need to look at, and also ensure that we invest and support with this process of the Global Fund, and make sure that young people, they are at the center of development and any change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tinashe. Thank you. Final remarks from your side, Lady Ross.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Well, I've already made my pitch for the 202 million.
Do it again, yes.
Which I'm going to do again.
And again,
And
yeah.
we really appreciate the work of civil society organizations to help advocate for this to Dutch MPs, and Alexander and Evert for also their advocacy and strong convincing, I'm sure, of their colleagues. But I just want to tell a story to close that describes the essence of the Global Fund. Boris is a Ukrainian LGBTI activist and coordinator of the National Paralegal Hub, which is funded by the Global Fund. It's a paralegal network run by the country's largest LGBTI organization. Peer paralegals, as you know, are members of communities that are increased risk of HIV infections: LGBTI people, sex workers, and people who use drugs. They're trained to support their peers to overcome incidents of stigma, discrimination, and other human rights violations. While this hub was built for peacetime, its members are now using it to respond to the new demands brought on by the war. In the last few months, the paralegals have helped dozens of people who've lost their homes to find temporary shelter. They've helped people who've been stuck in the middle of hostilities get to safer places. They've assisted people who've relocated to other parts of the country to secure new supplies of antiretroviral medication, pre-exposure prophylaxis, and condoms. They also continue to document incidents that are not related to the conflict, such as violence based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And while these last 100 plus days have tested the paralegals beyond their worst fears, the community in Ukraine, the LGBTI community, has proven resilient and adaptable throughout the conflict. This would not have been possible without the Global Fund.
Very true. Thank you. And looking at the clock, 30 seconds left. I see 2 thumbs up back at the director's room in Lyle. I would again thank you all and all the supporting organizations of this multi-party initiative for supporting us in everything that we do. Keep following us also, as politicians are always extremely busy running from one issue to the other, to keep sharp and to maintain focus on an issue that the Netherlands is a champion at and should stay a champion in the world. Because I think we have clearly demonstrated again, and we will keep on doing that also through the MPI, that without the support of the Netherlands, that will be a major setback and blow to women's rights, equal rights for girls, and for LGBTIQ plus people. So let's keep the struggle alive. Let's go on. And thank you for attending this event. Thank you, Lady Ross. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.